Hi, I'm Ghost Patrick Slass. I want to narrate for you The Lost Tragedy by Dennis McKail. I've been wanting to do this story. It's like today all these stories I've been wanting to do, I finally found them and whatnot. So anyways, this is a really nice story. It's from 1927 from a rare anthology. Some of these stories I had a beast of a time finding. I've been wanting to do them and I just couldn't find them. But all of a sudden today they all popped out. Something shifted in here or something. Do you ever have that happen? You're trying to do something, you just have all this resistance, and then all of a sudden it just falls away, and everything just pops. I'm not gonna give torch in the mouth. So, anyways, because I did the sweeper for you, and what was the man who came back? I had a beast of a time finding that one. And then this, I wanted to do this story a while ago. And then also want to do the Crown Derby plate. These are some, I don't know if I'd say favorites, but I've always liked these stories, and I was like, well, since I do this, I want to do stories that I like, not just the classic. Meaning, you understand. This is a very nice story. So it's a guy is at an estate sale, and he sees somebody that could be William Shakespeare. And then it's did it really happen, or was it just a dream? Is maybe life just a dream? Maybe some say we're in a matrix and asleep somewheres. That theme of that does come to mind to me a bit when I do the story. So let's get into it. The Lost Tragedy by Dennis McKail. Mr. Bunstable's bookshop represented a type of establishment which has pretty well disappeared from our modern cities. Indeed, but for the fear of becoming involved in correspondence with strangers, I should be prepared to go to considerably further and to say that it's the only shop of its kind still in existence. It is the only shop of its kind still in existence. In any case, it is most distinctly and unmistakably a survival from the past. And all who have considered the subject must agree. The principal object of any bookseller is to obstruct, as far as possible, the sale of books. The method generally adopted today is to fill the premises with intelligent young men with knobby foreheads who chase intending customers from shelf to shelf, thrusting novels at antiquarians, theological works at novel readers, and 2-volume biographies at those who obviously cannot afford them, until finally they have chased their victims right out into the street. This is called scientific salesmanship and is largely responsible for the profits shown by the circulating libraries. The old-fashioned method was directed at the same end, but by a totally different route. The intending customer was left utterly and entirely to himself. If he knew what he wanted to read, he read it without let or hindrance, and equally without payment. If he were just vaguely in search of an unidentified book, let us suppose for a wedding present, then he would wait for a period which variably according to his patience and temperament, and ultimately would take his departure and buy a silver sauce boat elsewhere. Mr. Bunstable was, and still is, a skilled exponent of this second and far earlier form of bookselling. He does not go in for window dressing, and the wares which are visible from the street seem to have been chosen principally for the power to exclude the daylight from the interior of the shop, and secondarily for a lack of interest which shall ensure their remaining undisturbed. If you persist in disregarding the warning of this window, your next difficulty is with the door. Owing to a slight settlement in the fabric of Mr. Bunstable's premises, it is impossible to open this door without the exercise of both strength and skill. But if you do succeed in opening it, then beware of the step which lurks just inside. Inexperienced customers usually arrive in the shop with a crash and a cry of alarm, and perhaps it is because of this that Mr. Bunstable has never troubled to repair the bell which hangs over his lintel and was occasionally intended to give notice of his client's approach. As your eyes become accustomed to the darkness within, you now detect one or more figures standing more or less erect with their legs more or less twisted round each other and profoundly absorbed in the books which they are reading. Here again, and before they've discovered that these figures are wearing hats, inexperienced customers have mistaken them for members of Mr. Bunstable's staff, but no contretemps has ever arisen from this misapprehension. The figures are so intent on their studies that they are deaf to any words which may be addressed to them, and the customer can retrieve his error without any spoken explanation. One imagines that Towards closing time, Mr. Bunstable must go round the shop, removing the volumes from the students' hands and gently pushing them back into the outer world. But it is almost as easy to suppose that some of them remained there all night. For so far as my own observation goes, Mr. Bunstable regards them as part of the fittings and fixtures. One day I must really go there at closing time and see what happens. Meanwhile, your eyes are becoming more and more acclimatized. You see vistas and vistas of books, books heaped up on the dusty floor, books rising in tiers to the mottled ceiling, books on tables, books piled precariously on a stepladder, books bursting out of the brown paper parcels, books balanced on the seats of chairs. You long to sneeze, for the violence of your entrance has sent a quantity of dust flying up your nose, but you can control yourself heroically. The atmosphere of the place would make such an outrage. It would be worse than sneezing in church. It was at this stage in my own case that just as I was wondering how on earth one ever bought anything in this extraordinary shop, that another of my senses was unexpectedly assailed. Somewhere for the moment, I couldn't tell where, a tune was being whistled. A short, monotonous air which suggested, "Here we go around the mulberry bush," and other works of that nature, and yet refused to be identified as anything that I'd ever heard before. I looked at the two drugged readers who were their only other visible occupants of the shop, but the sound wasn't coming from them. Nor, on the other hand, did they give any sign of interest or annoyance at the constant repetition of that little tune. You will sympathize, I hope, when I say that it had now become my most pressing requirement to track the whistler to his lair, and with this object in view I penetrated still further into the darkness of the shop, stepping over the heaps of books and the brown paper parcels, and soon losing all sense of direction in the labyrinth of shelves. All this while the tune continued, but as I felt my way forward, I noticed another peculiarity about it. The whistler seemed to have some rooted object of giving us the last note of his melody. Each time he had reached this point, and each time that I was convinced the keynote must be coming, he suddenly broke off, paused for a moment, and began again at the beginning. It was all that I could do not to supply the missing note myself, and yet if, as I now coming to believe, the music were proceeding from the proprietor of the shop, this was hardly the conventional way of introducing myself to his notice. Again I controlled myself, and then suddenly, as I turned yet another corner, I beheld the explanation of my puzzle. I was at the door of an inner sanctum or den, bursting with books, yet differing from the dusty profusion through which I had come into, that they were all neatly and carefully arranged, and between me and the window, which opened onto the prospect of unrelieved brickwork, there hung a small bird cage. "Oh," I explained aloud, "a bullfinch." At the same moment, a second inhuman silhouette appeared before the window. Afterwards, I saw that it had risen from a large desk, but at that time it had that startling effect of emerging as from a trap door, and what with this and my embarrassment at having been overheard, I took a hasty step backward. "Don't go, sir," said the silhouette. "Was there anything I could find for you?" It was in this way that I first met Mr. Edward Bunstable, the sole proprietor of the shop, which I have attempted to describe, and the individual to whom I owe the story that I am trying to relate. He was, and still is, a shortish gentleman, of a genial but moderate rotundity, the possessor of a beard and a pair of steel-rimmed spectacles. He knows more about out-of-the-way books than anyone I have ever met, and how in the world he keeps his trade going and pays rent, rates, and taxes out of it, it is impossible to guess. I have enjoyed the privilege of his acquaintanceship for a number of years now, but though he has frequently shown me volumes which he has bought, I've never yet been able to discover any volume which he has sold. Sometimes I think that he must be an eccentric millionaire, so utterly unbusinesslike are his ways of business. At other times I am fain to believe that he is some kind of fairy or ghost, or magician, or that he escaped from the pages of one of his mustiest volumes. But I think this is because secretly he rather enjoys mystifying me. There's been a hint of a twinkle from behind those steel-rimmed spectacles during some of our talks, which seemed to me to support this view. I have no idea where he sleeps, when he eats, or within about 40 years his age, maybe. On the other hand, I know all these particulars about his bullfinch, for within 3 minutes of our first meeting, and while I was still trying to get him the name of the book I wanted, he had told me about the bullfinch never left his room, that it subsisted on millet seed, and that it was 15 years old. I bought him cheap, he said, because he never could learn the last note of his song. I spent 10 years trying to teach it to him, but it was no use. That bird's got character, he has. "Oh, yes," I said. "But about this book I was wondering." "That bird," interrupted Mr. Bunstable, "is a regular Londoner. He's as sharp as they are made, that bird is." He told me a great deal more about his bullfinch's alleged characteristics, before I could succeed in giving him the particulars of the book I was after. Then he nodded his head with an air of infinite wisdom. I've got it, he said. I can't just lay my hands on it at the moment, but if you were to come back, say, in 2 or 3 days' time, knowing no better, I did as I was asked. Mr. Bunchbull said that he was still searching for the book. He was more convinced than ever that it was somewhere on the premises, but his general attitude towards the affair was that it was no use hurrying things. The suggestion conveyed to me at the time was that if once the book became aware that he was looking for it, it might take fright and disappear for good. After telling me a number of anecdotes of a literary flavor, and showing me several of his most recent purchases, which he was careful to explain were not to be included in his stock, he proposed that I should pay him another visit, say in about a week or 10 days. I'll be certain I've got it for you by then, he added. I know I've got it put away somewhere. Excuse me. To cut a long story short, the object of my original inquiry has eluded Mr. Bunchbull's search to this day. He is still hopeful about it, though I have long since abandoned any expectation of its ever coming to light, just as I have long since outgrown the whim which made me ask for it. If he would ever find it, of course, I would offer to buy it. This would at least be due to a man who, at very moderate reckoning, has spent about a fortnight of working days in trying to oblige a customer. I shall not be surprised, however, if after the event of its turning up, Mr. Bunchbull refuses to part with it, for in the meantime, there have been 1 or 2 near shaves, when I have tried to purchase other volumes from his collection, and each time he's managed to prevent the sale taking place. Don't take it now, he said. I'll find a better copy if you wait, or I wouldn't have it if I were you, sir. There'll be a new edition out in the spring. If I'm still persistent, he meshes me in one of his long and hypnotic anecdotes, edging me quietly towards the door as he tells it. By this means, I am caused to forget the quest which had drawn me to his shop, and his honor as an old-fashioned bookseller is preserved. Inexplicable old gentleman, even now as I set this description on paper, I found myself wondering whether he and his shop can really exist. And perhaps this uncertainty is one of the reasons I keep going back there. I want to convince myself that I haven't made it all up. So we arrive at the story which Mr. Bunchbull told me one evening last autumn, beginning in the recesses of his inner sanctum, with the bullfinch contributing its familiar obligato, and finishing it at the front door of his shop as he bowed to me into the foggy street. A good title for it might be The Lost Tragedy. Personally, said Mr. Bunchbull, I'm a great one for you, and perhaps you'll say that's natural enough. But there's some big men in my trade, men who are up to all the tricks of the auction room, who'd buy and sell books by 1,000 and never yet read anything but a catalog or newspaper or maybe a railway timetable. Not that they weren't fond of books, but just the bindings were. It was the bindings they cared for, or the leaves being uncut, or the first edition with all the misprints and the suppressed preface. You know, sir, the things that run up the value of a book without any reference to what the book's about. Of course, we've all got to watch for these details, but to my mind, when all's said and done, the book's a thing to read. You can't get away from that, sir. But the man I learned the business from, old Mr. Trumpet, I was 20 years in his shop in Panton Street before I set up my own. He wouldn't have agreed with me, not he, sir. He got an eye for rarities which was worth a fortune. He'd got a collection of old editions which was worth another fortune, and he could run rings round anyone in the sale-room. But he didn't worry about what was inside a book, not he. Many times he hauled me over the coals for sitting reading in the shop. You stick to the title pages, my boy, he said. That's all the bookseller needs to know about, and I'll say that for Mr. Trumpet. He certainly practiced what he preached. He used to travel about a great deal, attending sales outside London or helping evaluations for probate where there was a big library. And sometimes, though not as often as I would have liked, he'd take me along with him. It was a wonder to me that the way he'd go into a room full of books in an old country house, all arranged anyhow, with no catalogue or anything to help him, and he'd pick out all the plums within 5 or 10 minutes of getting there. It was almost as if he could smell them out, sir. Uncanny, you'd have called it, if you'd seen him on the job. Partly for practice and partly to amuse himself, I'd try sometimes if I couldn't find anything valuable that he missed, but I couldn't say that it ever succeeded. The nearest I ever came to was with this book that I'm telling you about. We'd gone down to a big country house, where the owner had died, to see if he could pick anything up. The young fellow who'd come into the property was all for selling everything that he could, but when it came to the library, the whole place was in such a mess that no one could trouble to take a proper inventory. The auctioneer's instructions were to sell the old books off in bundles as they stood on the bookshelves, and seeing the quantity of litter there was, I can't say it was a bad idea. The bindings had been pretty good in their day, though that had been some time ago, but as for the stuff inside, well, it wasn't just typical sermons and court histories. county histories and so forth that you could buy up anywhere, a regular lot of rubbish. We got down there the morning of the day when the part of the sale was coming on, and old Mr. Trumpet didn't take long to size it all up. He marked down a few bundles, which might about cover our railway fees if we got them at a proper price. And then he was just thinking about getting some lunch when I pointed out to him that there was a shelf over one of the doors that we hadn't looked at. Nonsense, he said, for he didn't like admitting he could have missed anything. I saw them when I came here first in. Of course, we both quite knew that he'd done nothing of the sort, but it wasn't going to pay me to get into any argument with him. So I must have just made up my mind that I'd come back after he'd gone and have a glance at those books myself. Perhaps I'll get a chance, I thought, to show him I'm not so ignorant as he thinks. So just as we were going to go out the front door, I pretended I'd left my pencil case in the library. I went back there alone. To my surprise, for I hadn't seen anyone, for I hadn't been gone more than a minute, and we certainly hadn't met anyone in the way. There was a gentleman standing on a chair, with his back to me, reaching up at that particular shelf over the inner door. He'd got a cloak on rather like people used to wear in Scotland, and as I could see a pair of rough stockings underneath it, I made up my mind he was a gopher. And he was running through the books very quick and anxious-like, but he must have heard my step, for he stopped suddenly and turned round on his chair. He was rather a short gentleman, and a bit pale, rather thin on the top, if you know what I mean, with a little pointed beard. It struck me that I'd seen him somewhere before, or else his photograph, but I couldn't put a name to him at the time. And of course, well, I'll come to that later. He was looking at me so curiously that I felt I had to say something, so I thought I'd better explain what I'd come back for. When you finished, sir, I said I wanted to look through that shelf for myself. And as he didn't answer, though I was certain he'd heard me quite clearly, I added, I've come down from London for the sale. He nodded very gravely and politely and turned back to the bookshelf. He kept on taking out volume after another and shoving them back in again as soon as he'd looked inside. Then all of a sudden he gave a little gasp, and I saw him staring at an old quarto bound in calf that he'd just opened. The next moment he popped it under his cloak and jumped off the chair. Well, I'd seen some pretty cool customers in the book trade before now, but this seemed to me to be a bit too cool. Here, I called out, back in between him and the door. Where are you going with that book? You can't take it away like that. Can't I? Said he. It seemed to me that he spoke like some kind of West Countryman. It's mine. But you're not Mr. Hatteras, are you? I asked, naming the heir to the property. For you see, this gentleman was about 50, I should judge. No, he said, but the book is mine, and if I choose to take it with me, what is that to you? It shall never have been printed. Well, sir, at that last remark of his, I'll admit that I thought he was a little bit, well, you know what I mean. Here Mr. Bunstable tapped his forehead expressively. But that didn't seem to be any reason why he should make off with something that wasn't his. Look here, sir, I said, I don't want to make any trouble. But I saw you putting a book from that shelf under your cloak, and unless you put it back where it came from, I shall have to tell the auctioneer. The auctioneer, he repeated, looking a bit puzzled. Yes, I said, if you want that book out of this room, you can bid for it at the sale this afternoon. And as he was still looking kind of silly, I looked at the card and had pinned over the shelf. Lot 56, I said, if you want that book, the proper way to get it is to bid for lot 56. For a moment, I thought he was going to make a dash past me, but I wasn't surprised. When he changed his mind, for he was a very nervous-looking gentleman, and he wouldn't have stood much chance if I'd wanted to stop him. So be it, said he, and he climbed out of the chair again, and put the book back where he'd found it. Then with a funny sort of way look at me, he went straight out of the room. I wonder where I've seen that face before. I kept on thinking, but I couldn't put a name to it. Well, sir, by this time I saw that it was going to get... if I was going to get any lunch, I should have to run for it. And as I was a young man in those days, I decided to leave that bookshelf and try to slip in again before the sale started. As I was going out to the hall, I ran into the auctioneer's clerk, and I thought it mightn't be a bad thing if I told him what he'd seen. All right, he said when I finished, I'll lock the library door if there's anything of that sort going on. But did you say the gentleman had just come out now? Yes, I said, just a minute before I did. That's funny, he answered. I was in the hall here the whole time, and I could have sworn nobody came by. Well, it was funny, you see what I mean? And so we both laughed a good deal of the time. Though apart from the principle of the thing, I said there's precious few books which are worth more than sixpence. That's as it may be, said the clerk cautiously, and I left him and hurried off to the inn. When I told Mr. Trumpet, he said, that sounds like Badger of Liverpool. He'll get shut up one of these days if he's not careful. And he pulled out his copy of the sale catalogue and made a pencil mark against lot 56. He's a cunning old bird, he added. If there's anything I miss, we'll give him a run for his money, and we did. I had no opportunity of seeing that shelf again, for the library was still locked when I got back, and the sale was to take place in the dining room. but there was Mr. Badger of Liverpool in his cloak and his golf stockings, watching each lot as it came by and was knocked down. And when we got to lot 56, he started bidding like a good un. Mr. Trumpet sat there nodding his head to the auctioneer for everyone but these two had soon dropped out. But when the price for the odd dozen books that ran up to £125, I suppose he felt he'd gone far enough in a pig in a poke. He closed his eyes and shook his head in the way he had when he finished bidding, and the auctioneer brought his hammer down on the thump. Of course, I thought we'd heard the last of lot 56, but just as I was crossing off my list, I heard the auctioneer having some kind of argument with the successful bidder. "These are no good to me," he was saying, holding out a pocket full of coins. "I can't take foreign money for my deposit." Mr. Badger had a very nervous-looking gentleman, as I think I've told you, and he didn't seem to know what to make of this. He kept on snapping his fingers and starting sentences he couldn't finish, but it was no use. The auctioneer simply dropped the money on his desk for Mr. Badger to take and leave as he chose, and announced that he was putting the lot up again. The little mystery and excitement that had been sent it up to £77.10, but at that figure the competition stopped. Mr. Trumpet got what he wanted. I could see the auctioneer looking pretty sick, but he was quite right, of course. Whatever these coins were, they had been no good to his employers. Why, some of them were scarcely even round. Well, sir, we stopped on and picked up one or two more lots that we'd arranged for having them caught up in London, and we took a fly back to the station and caught our train. In the meantime, I suddenly remember rather a curious thing that I mentioned to Mr. Trumpet. "Did you see where Mr. Badger went to?" I asked. "I never saw him leave the room, but he wasn't there when we came away, I'll swear." Mr. Trumpet looked at me steadily. Let's see, wait. Mr. Trumpet looked at me quite queer, like. "Badger," he repeated. "What do you mean?" "Why, I said that gentleman who bid against you for lot 56. Then he goes, "That wasn't Badger." Then who was it?" says I. I feel as if I'd seen his face somewhere, but Mr. Trumpet had no idea. "I feel as if I'd seen his face somewhere," he said presently, "or else he's like someone I've met, but I'm bothered if I can place him. If you ask me," he said a little later on, "he'd broken loose from somewhere. Did you see the way his eyes were rolling?" "Yes," I said, "quite a frenzy, wasn't it?" But of course my literary illusion was wasted on Mr. Trumpet. He only grunted and we dropped the subject for good. "Well," reasoned Mr. Bunstable, who had now got me out of his labyrinth into the main part of the story. "A few days after that, the packing case came along from the sale, and although Mr. Trumpet would likely enough have let it lie in the cellar for weeks, for he took his time over most things, I thought I'd go down and look through the stuff myself. You see, I'd got it still in the back of my head that our golfing friend might have a bit more than we'd had given him credit for, that there really might be some sort of find in lot 56. And if there was, then I meant to get to the bottom of it. So late that afternoon, I took a candle down to the cellar. We'd no gas except in the shop itself in those days. And I got a tack lifter and a hammer and started opening the case. Out of it all came, most of it just about fit for a barrel in the street, though every now and then I'd find one of the books that Mr. Trumpet had spotted, and presently I'd got right down to the last straw. And there, the last book to come out, was the calf-bound quarto that the gentleman had in the cloak had tried to make away with. The label had come off the back and the leaves were still uncut, but when I turned to the title page, well, I tell you, sir, I thought for a moment I must be dreaming. What would you say, sir, if you picked up an old book and found it was a play by Shakespeare that no one had ever imagined as existing? Would you believe your eyes? I tell you, I could scarcely believe mine. Yet, there it was, paper, type and binding all above suspicion, as I knew well enough, and on the title page, The Tragedy of Alexander the Great by Mr. William Shakespeare. Oh my God, imagine being Shakespeare. That would be so awesome. I feel like Christopher Columbus and Marconi were rolled into one. The biggest discovery of the century, and I sat there by myself in Mr. Trumpet's cellar. Had made it. I sat down on the edge of that packing case and fairly gasped for breath. It was the most tremulous moment in my life. Of course, I knew it was my real duty to rush up the ladder in the shop and tell Mr. Trumpet what I found. And of course, I meant to do this as soon as I collected my wits. But when I sat there staring at the little page, I realized more and more clearly what Mr. Trumpet would do. The book would go straight into his safe, uncut as it was, so as to keep up the value. When it left the safe, it would be to go direct to the saleroom, and from there, unless an act of Parliament stopped it, to an American collector. If I carried out my duty without a thought of the consequences, my first opportunity of reading the tragedy of Alexander the Great would be in a facsimile or reprint, just as if the original had never been in my hands at all. And I wanted to read it now. I was enough of a bookseller to recognize its enormous value. But unlike Mr. Trumpet, I was too much of a book lover to let that American collector read it first. Damn those Americans. I wasn't going to cut the leaves, of course. I knew better than to do that, but they were pretty wide margins, and by twisting the pages carefully I could manage well enough, and so, sitting down on the packing case and by the light of the candle, I began right away. Act 1, Scene 1, a room in King Philip's palace. Yes, I remember that, but I'm thankful I can't remember anymore. Did I say thankful? Well, sir, I'm afraid I mean it. I don't pretend to be a poet myself, but in the ordinary way. I'll admit there may be better critics, but when it comes to a real piece of downright incompetent, careless writing, of bad Scanson and worse grammar, of loud-sounding, pretentious, and meaningless claptrap, I love that word, then I'll take leave to say that I'm as good a judge as most men. It was awful, sir. It was terrible. It was like a parody of the worst kind of Elizabethan poetry. And yet, if you see what I mean, it was Elizabethan poetry. Not a word, not a phrase to give the show away, as there are in Chatterton's forgeries. It was like Shakespeare read through some kind of distorting lens with all the faults and weaknesses. For he had faults and weaknesses, sir, maligned 10,000 times, and all the beauty cancelled right out. No wonder they kept this out of the first folio, I kept on telling myself. As yet I couldn't put it down. However bad it may be, it was useless. It was, unless some contemporary had played an expensive practical joke, the discovery that I had taken it for, as I, for the first time, my own contemporaries to read it. In spite of myself, through my excitement, had given way to an almost overwhelming sense of depression. If you really found a book, sir, that's always the way a piece of thoroughly bad workmanship takes you. I don't know how long I'd been down that cellar, resumed Mr. Bunchbull after a short, mournful pause, when all of a sudden I heard a kind of thud overhead, and looking up I saw that someone had closed the trap at the top of the ladder. Good heavens, I thought. There's Mr. Trumpet going off for the night, and if I don't hurry after him, I shall be locked in. I jumped up, picked up my candle, and was just moving to the foot of the ladder when, to my astonishment, I saw that 2 men were standing in my way. It seemed to me that they were in some kind of fancy dress. And with my bewilderment, the way they managed to get in, I very nearly dropped the candle. Then as I recovered it, I recognized the shorter of them. It was the old gentleman that I'd last seen at the sale down the country, the gentleman I'd taken for Mr. Badger Liverpool. What's the matter? I asked in a shaking kind of voice. What do you want, sir? He didn't answer me, but turned to his companion, a big burly sort of fellow, who struck me as knowing pretty well what the bottom of a pint pot looked like. Did you bolt the trap, Ben? He asked. Are you sure the old man's gone? What do you take me for? Said the big fellow, speaking with a kind of rough Cockney accent. Of course it's gone. Now then, he had, looking at me, we've come for that book. Where have you put it? I had it under my arm, but before I could answer him, he spotted. Ah, he said. There you are, Will. What did I tell you? Didn't I say we'd find it here? They both seemed tremendously excited, and I was convinced that they'd been drinking, but I wasn't going to stand any nonsense. I don't know what you're doing here, I said, retreating behind the packing case, or how you forced your way in, but this book has been bought and paid for by my employer, Mr. Trumpet. And let me remind you that you've no right into the private part of the shop. The big man only laughed at this, but the others started talking 16 to the dozen. Oh, let me tell you, he said, that book was published without any authority. That script was stolen from the theater, and that anyone who keeps it is a receiver of stolen goods. Do you know what I spent in buying up that edition from the blackguard who printed it? 200 angels. And do you know how long I've been hunting for that copy he kept back? Nearly 300 years. And I've found it at last, and I'm going to see that it's destroyed. I've got my reputation protected the same as anyone else. And if I did a bit of pot boiling because I got into debt, there's no reason why it should be brought up against me now. I've had enough trouble over Pericles and Titus Andronicus without being saddled with a bit of balderdash like Alexander the Great. You got the better of me down in Gloucester last week, but it's my turn now. I've got good friends, I have, who'll see that justice is done. If I'm a bit scant of breath myself, there's my old colleague Johnson, who's killed his man more than once, and will do it again, for the honor of the profession. Now then, sir, are you going to hand it over, or do you want the taste of Ben's dagger in your gullet? Oh my, what a fierce man. That's the way he ran on, sir, though I may not have got all the words quite right. And all the time the other man was rocking and shaking with laughter. I was so scared I could hardly think. For it was no joke being shut down there with these two fellows like that. Mad they might be, or drunk, or both together, but whenever they came I could see that it would stick at nothing, and yet... Well, sir, it's no use reproaching myself, and besides, after all these years, I'm not at all sure that the actual upshot wasn't the best for everybody. The big fellow had jumped right over the packing case and twisted my arms together behind my back, while the little one snatched the book from where it had fallen, tore out the sheets, and burned them one by one in the flame of my candle. Then he threw the empty binding down on the cellar floor. All's well that ends well, he said. He had his lesson, Ben. You can let him go. And then he stooped down and blew out the candle. As he reached this stage in his remarkable narrative, Mr. Bunstable stretched past me with one hand and opened the door of his shop. A cold draught accompanied by a wisp of London fog blew in through the aperture, causing me to shiver, and Mr. Bunstable to utter his dry, grating cough. Far away I heard the indomitable bullfinch once more barking out his incomplete melody. The rest was silence. You mean, I said presently, that it was a dream? Eh? Said Mr. Bunstable, starting from his thoughts. Well, sir, as to that I should hardly like to say. I certainly spent the night in the cellar, as Mr. Trumpet could tell you if he were alive, and I'll have to admit that there were no traces of that book on the floor, no ashes, even when I looked for them in the morning, and yet that doesn't seem to me to explain everything. Because, sir, there was no calf-bound quarto there either. You've only got my word for it, of course, but, and here gently but firmly, Mr. Bunstable shut me out into the fog. Oh my. That's a delightful story. So that was The Lost Tragedy by Dennis McKail, and very good. Very good. And it reminds me, that story influenced somebody who recently wrote The London Fae. That story influenced them, I think. No, like, their work is original, but they were influenced by that. Because it's a charming story. It really is. That story has always stayed with me. And so anyways, and if you haven't read The London Fae, you need to. That's an excellent book too. And I'll put a link for that, because I do have the link saved down my bookmarks. I'll put it for you guys. You need to check it out. It's a wonderful book. They're both wonderful stories. You just heard me narrate this, and then check out The London Fae. Like I said, I'll put a link for it. So, thank you for watching. If you have any requests, put them. I want to do W.T. Stead, How the Mail Steamer Went Down. This one with the Titanic. And what was the other one? Oh, and the Crown Derby plate was another one that's been like on the list. And then also I want to do, I don't know if I'm going to get to them all tonight, but They by Rudyard Kipling. And I'm not smart. It's a very sad story actually, but Rudyard Kipling is a wonderful writer. And Claremont. It's a French vampire story. I think more in the earlier 20th century, no, 1900s. I mean, before Carmilla and Dracula, the Kaz. I better go attend to her, to the spoiled brat. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.